Here we are, Part 6, now in its 12th printing. The sound of a wild snail eating. Ready? Me too. Part 6, Familiar Territory. A quote from Edward O. Wilson from Biophilia, 1984. The crucial first step to survival in all organisms is habitat selection. If you get to the right place, everything else is likely to be easier. Chapter 19, Release. Another small poem from Kobayashi Issa, 1763 to 1828. Climb Mount Fuji, O snail, but slowly, slowly. By midsummer, my dog, Brandy, and I were moved home. It was hard to say which of us was happier. Her cedar bed was in its familiar place, positioned in the living room to catch the morning sun. From my own bed in this same room, there was so much to take in that it was hard to know where to look first. There were the sturdy posts and beams that framed the space around me, the art on the walls, so full of color and life, and the window at my bedside table with its view of the natural world. In the middle of the night, I was sometimes startled awake by an always mysterious bang coming from somewhere upstairs, but I felt only amused fondness for the escapes of the resident centuries-old ghost. I was used to the familiar eccentricities of my house, and this eased the transition of the move, though the adjustment to less day help was difficult. I missed the companionship of my original snail, but the time had come to return it to its wild woods. I hoped that by fall I'd be managing well enough that its single remaining offspring could come to stay with me for the winter. Snails with the longest lifespans are often found in the most rugged climates. Given New England's deep winters, my snail would probably live several more years. There would be further lengthy courtships and additional generations of offspring. After its sheltered life in the terrarium, the snail would have to readjust to the challenges of the woods, the dangerous predators, and the unpredictable weather. But with its many methods of defense and its dormancy skills, it had survived before, and I felt certain that it would do so again. I wished I could attend the snail's release, but now that I was home, I was too far away. A letter arrived from my previous caregiver describing how she had left the one remaining offspring in the terrarium and carried the original snail back to the place in the woods where it had been found. And here's a paragraph of a quote. On a misty day, I took the snail out to a spot beneath an old oak tree. I set it on top of a wild mushroom. The snail became interested in the situation. It came partway out of its shell and then extended its head out over thin air, gradually moving its body downward until it touched ground, while still having its tail up on the mushroom's cap. Gracefully, it brought down its shell and tail, and with its tentacles pointed straight ahead, it made steady progress over leaves and twigs for the shelter of a downed oak limb. The original snail and I had been fellow captives, but now we had both returned to our natural habitats. As I tried to make my life suitable within a few rooms of my house, I wondered how the snail was coping in its native woods. Though I was home, I was still not free from the boundaries of my illness. I thought of the terrarium's limited space and how the snail had seemed content as it ate, explored, and fulfilled a life cycle. This gave me hope that perhaps I, too, could still fulfill dreams, even if they were changed dreams. Being home again was the next best thing to a cure, and though my physical limitations were still great, I was no longer completely bedridden. I was able to make occasional, brief but satisfying journeys within the house. I might retrieve some papers from a few yards away in the late morning, and then in late afternoon I'd try a rash trip around the corner to the kitchen for a fresh glass of water. I was elated to be able to manage these tiny tasks, though I paid dearly in exacerbated symptoms. From my bedside window, I could follow the ever-changing weather, the wind's gentle stirrings and rages, the varied moods of rain, the interplay of sun and moon and clouds. And in the midsummer heat, the gardens surrounding my farmhouse were alive with color. There was the constant activity of small creatures flying among my perennials, hummingbirds and butterflies, moths, wasps, bumblebees, and countless other insects. There were so many different flight patterns, and the variety of wing shapes, body sizes, and structures and types of landing gear was impressive. The flow of aerial activity was so dense that I thought of it as a miniature version of New York's LaGuardia Airport. Given the chaos of different species whooshing by all the time, it was astonishing that there weren't constant collisions. As I window watched, I observed the comings and goings of my neighbors. They, too, were part of the rhythm of my familiar rural landscape. They would depart for work or errands, and later return, walk their dogs, cut firewood, and check their roadside mailboxes. As twilight deepened, the low dart of a nighthawk over the field would catch my eye. Darkness brought the sparking of secret codes from the mate-seeking fireflies. Then, black on black, the swift shapes of bats would swoop for late-night morsels, and the hooting of owls would come softly from the woods, until all was quiet and still beneath the ancient brightness of distant stars and the shape-shifting moon. That's the end of the chapter. Chapter 20, Winter Snail. Another poem from Kobayashi Isa. Closing the door, he drops off to sleep. Snail. The months passed, and leaves of flaming reds and oranges floated past my window, scattering and drifting. I was well settled at home, so the snail's single remaining offspring came to keep me company. This time, the terrarium was a huge antique glass bowl with a 48-inch circumference. It created a wonderful green spherical world. The juvenile snail was about 1/3 the size of an acorn. It took to sleeping during the day inside a hollow, rotting birch branch, which provided a perfect, dark, damp hiding place. Occasionally, I'd use a flashlight to look in and check on it. As the days grew short, the winter's stillness was broken by the abstract, shifting patterns of snow in the air. I watched the flakes change their shape and size moment to moment as they played on the wind. They would rush downward only to rise on an updraft, swirl gracefully around, and then descend once more, vanishing into the whiteness that surrounded the house. Periodically, howling blizzard winds would hide the dark green spruce woods from my view and leave behind an even thicker snow covering. Beneath this cold blanket, wild snails were hibernating snug in their burrows. Did they dream while they slept? And if so, were the dreams composed entirely of smell and taste and touch? Or had they drifted into a sleep so deep as to be without thought or memory? Inside my house, the weather conditions were quite different. The oil furnace kept the air warm and dry. Instead of digging a hole and hibernating, my young snail estivated for several weeks at a time. It would either disappear inside the hollow birch branch or dangle upside down from the underside of a polypody fern. When it woke, it would eat mushroom and soil, drink water, and rasp at the inside of the mussel shell for minerals. Then it would head for the dark birch hollow or climb back up a fern frond and estivate again. There was a paradox of speed in relation to distance and time that began to intrigue me. In contrast to its slow locomotion, my snail's life cycle was quick. In 70 years, it could produce 70 generations, compared to the 3 generations a human might produce. Although the snail moved more slowly than a human through the physical world, it traveled more quickly than a human along its pathway as an evolving species. My snail's quick life cycle also brought to mind a paradox within my own human world. While some aspects of society, such as technology and communications, were continually speeding up, other aspects, such as healthcare, moved at a pace even slower than my snail. During the months that I waited for appointments, underwent tests, and tried new treatments, my original snail laid its eggs, hatched its young, was returned to the woods, and then in late fall went into hibernation. As the winter months passed, I noticed a change in my snail-watching behavior. The previous spring, when I could do almost nothing, spending time with a snail had been pure entertainment. But as my functional abilities improved just a bit, watching a snail began to take patience. I wondered at what point in my convalescence I might leave the snail's world behind. The original snail held a place in my heart forever, and while I was fond of its offspring, it was often estivating, and I was often distracted by other things. Friends would stop by and take Brandy out for a winter hike in the woods trails. From the window, I'd watch as my dog bounded through the snowdrifts. For sheer pleasure, she'd nosedive into their depths, rolling onto her back for an icy bath, her paws waving ecstatically at the winter sky. Neighbors checked in on me, bringing the recent local news. A cow had taken off and was eventually found wandering through the woods, and cross-country skiers, enjoying an unseasonably warm late February afternoon, had popped off their skis, stripped down to their undergarments, climbed up a large boulder covered with leafless vines, and sunbathed, only to find, days later, that they were unexpectedly itchy, a rare outbreak of midwinter poison ivy. And there were stories I'd missed while I was away. A neighbor's dog had arrived home one spring day with a wild turkey egg, unharmed, held gently in his mouth. I was grateful for and appreciative of my closest friends and neighbors, but I still missed the outer layers of society, the acquaintances, with their dual air of familiarity and mystery, and the interesting newcomers who enliven everything. Each relapse contracts my life down to the core, and each time I've started to make my slow way back, over many years, toward the life I once knew, I find that nothing is quite as I remember. In my absence, the world has changed. The banks of snow were melting away, and the air hinted at the coming spring. The young snail was still estivating on a fern frond. Thinking that it would be hungry when it awoke, I put a fresh mushroom in the terrarium and wondered if the snail would sense the lengthening days. I was eager for open windows and the chance to be outside, even if just a few feet from the house. I wrote to one of my doctors, quote, I could never have guessed what would get me through this past year, a woodland snail and its offspring. I honestly don't think I would have made it otherwise. Watching another creature go about its life somehow gave me, the watcher, purpose too. If life mattered to the snail, and the snail mattered to me, it meant something in my life mattered, so I kept on. Snails may seem like tiny, even insignificant things compared to the wars going on around the world or a million other human problems, but they may well outlive our own species. That's the end of the chapter. Chapter 21, Spring Rain, and then epilogue. All right. Chapter 21, Spring Rain. Another poem, of course, by Kobayashi Isa. In this falling rain, where are you off to, snail? The first cold rains arrived, and as the weeks passed and the weather warmed, the spring peepers and wood frogs began to sing in the evenings. With the increased humidity, the young snail woke up, climbed down from its fern frond, and became active again. It would soon be mature, and the time had come to release it to the wild so that it could establish a territory and search for a mate. Life without a snail was hard to contemplate. I would miss its quiet presence, but I knew the spring showers would ensure an ample supply of fresh food, giving it the best chance of survival. I wrote another letter to my doctor. We have rain today. I've been looking out the window from my daybed, wishing I could do what I'd do if it weren't for this illness, which is to put on my boots and raincoat, grab a shovel, and move dozens of plants around. One spring, in a rain shower, I dug up all my tulips in full bloom and wandered around the yard, holding them by their 2-foot necks, with the bulb and roots dangling down, and the tulip flowers staring up at me with their big cyclops-like eyes. I decided, based on color, just where to relocate each one. If you move plants in the rain, they hardly even know it, and they did just fine. Today is a perfect snail letting go day. And that's the end of the letter. Hatched and raised in a terrarium, the young snail had been served the finest of portobello mushrooms and fresh water in a blue mussel shell. It had never encountered the dangers that lurked in the woods. It would have to survive on its own ingenuity, and I hoped that it would find its new home an interesting and delicious place, both familiar and very surprising. I could now occasionally manage to walk the short distance to the edge of the woods. One evening, after a light rain had turned to drizzle, I carried the young snail to a spot beneath some large hardwood trees, backed by a stone wall. Placing it gently on the ground, I watched as it came part way out of its shell. Its tentacles lengthened, twitching with interest, and it moved them this way and that in response to the abundance of fresh odors. It explored some dead leaves, some dark green moss, a bit of lichen, and the big root of a tree. I watched it glide slowly through the dusk and vanish into the dark. For the first time, the young snail was in a world without boundaries. I wondered what it would think of this unexpected freedom. What kind of nighttime adventures would it have while I slept? And where would it hide the next morning for its daytime rest? How would it choose a territory in an endless wilderness? That's the end of the chapter. Wait a minute, here's another chapter, a very small chapter. Another chapter. What a surprise. Chapter 22, Night Stars. And a quote from Edward O. Wilson from Biophilia. Humanity is exalted not because we are so far above other living creatures, but because knowing them well elevates the very concept of life. All right. My gardens were awakening, and whenever possible, I was outside on a chaise longue. Is that how you say that? Chaise longue? Chaise longue? It looks like chaise longue to me. Well, anyway. I was outside on a chaise longue with Brandy at my side. We watched the sunlight find its way through the branches of the crab-apple tree, dappling the blue squill and crocus, and we looked for the pointed noses of tulip leaves as they emerged in the perennial beds. Each week, more flowers came into bloom, and the hedge that bordered the garden began to fill with nesting birds. Having flown several thousand miles, the ruby-throated hummingbirds appeared and took up their usual summer residence in the old apple trees. They spent their time zooming between the flower beds in front of the house and the patch of poppies in the back, competing for nectar in midair with the multicolored butterflies in an ancient interspecies dance. I could close my eyes and feel the sun warm my whole length, and the wind ruffle its way over me, my ears filled with the dozy hum of bees, and those tiny and odd insect sounds that rise up all around, the sounds mingling in my mind with the good, deep smell of earthy life. Spring turned to summer, summer turned to fall, the snow came, and the snail and its offspring were still much in my thoughts. The original snail had been the best of companions. It never asked me questions I couldn't answer, nor did it have expectations I couldn't fulfill. I had watched it adapt to changed circumstances and persevere. Naturally solitary and slow-paced, it had entertained and taught me, and was beautiful to watch as it glided silently along, leading me through a dark time into a world beyond that of my own species. The snail had been a true mentor. Its tiny existence had sustained me. Late one winter night, I wrote in my journal, "A last look at the stars, and then to sleep. Lots to do at whatever pace I can go. I must remember the snail. Always remember the snail." And an epilogue with a wonderful drawing of the ferns. All the pictures I have not been showing you. An epilogue. I think there is another section that I also wanted to read. There are several sections that I'll walk you through, but there's an epilogue, and acknowledgments. I don't think I'm going to read you the acknowledgments, but there was something else in here that I wanted to read to you. I think there's a little one-page appendix. So, on to the epilogue. And a quote from Rainer Maria Rilke, 1903, from Letters to a Young Poet, 1927. Perhaps then, some day far in the future, you will gradually, without even noticing it, live your way into the answer. My snail observations are from a single year of nearly 2 decades of illness. I have merged that story and a few non-snail stories with my later scientific readings. The research for this book and the gradual process of its writing matched the slow pace of its protagonist and were just as nocturnal. I found myself once again following the snail deep into its life. While I was snail watching, there was much I did not know about my small companion, and there was just as much I did not know about my illness. I was curious about snail species, and solving that puzzle would take several attempts and the help of a few experts. Even more challenging was the mystery of the pathogen that had forever changed the course of my life, and I would track down the likely culprit. There was also the unknown future, my own, and that of all living species. Here's a little subheading called A Question of Species. The snail and its offspring were wild creatures. They represented 500 million years of gastropod evolution. I wanted to understand their place in such a venerable lineage. From a book by John Birch, How to Know the Eastern Land Snails, I learned that my snail was of the subclass Pulmonata, having a lung and making temporary epiphragms for dormancy, instead of the permanent operculum that is attached to the foot of snails of some species, allowing them to shut their door each time they withdraw into their shell. There are 60 families of Pulmonata, land snails in the world, encompassing some 20,000 species, and so I continued on discovering its order Stylomatophora, which are eyes at the tips of the tentacles, mostly terrestrial, and the family Polygyridae, the reflected shell lip and large size. I'm not sure. All right, I'm keeping on here. As to genus and species, I was at a standstill. It would take an expert to make that final determination based on information I didn't have, such as whether the interior of the shell had a tooth-like nub, which I couldn't have seen with a live snail inside. I contacted Tim Pierce, assistant curator and head of the section of mollusks at the Carnegie Museum of Natural History, as well as the biologist Ken Hotop at Appalachian Conservation Biology. In a series of emails, Tim and Ken discussed the identifying details they could glean from my photos. They considered shell depth and number of whorls, and even the color of the eye granules at the tip of the tentacles, until finally an agreement was reached on the snail's genus and species, Neohelix albolabris. Neo for new, helix for spiral, and albolabris meaning white-lipped. White-lipped forest snail is the common name. And these North American natives roam the humid woodlands as far as Georgia, as far north as Ontario and Quebec, and west to the Mississippi. Here's another, we have 2 other little sections. Invisible boundaries is the next one. The Earth is home to millions of potential pathogens, of which 1,000 or so depend on human hosts. The pathogen I contracted was, in its own way, an author. It rewrote the instructions followed within every cell in my body, and in doing so, it rewrote my life, making off with nearly all my plans for the future. My illness had started with flu-like symptoms and some paralyzed skeletal muscles. Within weeks, it had turned into systemic paralysis-like weakness with life-threatening complications. After a slow and partial recovery over 3 years, I had successive severe relapses. Specialized testing brought a diagnosis of autoimmune dysautonomia, a dysfunction of the autonomic nervous system, which can cause paralysis of the circulatory and gastrointestinal systems. Dysautonomia can make it difficult for a person to stand or sit upright because the blood vessels cannot maintain circulation against the pull of gravity. Astronauts experience this problem when readjusting to the Earth's gravitational field. At one end of the orthostatic intolerance spectrum is syncope, or syncope, perhaps. Syncope? A person might stand up, but then immediately faint. At the other end of the spectrum are cases like mine. In an upright position, the body just gets weaker and weaker as it tries unsuccessfully to maintain blood pressure. The ability to be upright is a recent evolutionary adaptation, and it is still surprisingly fragile. The weight of the world doesn't pin me down figuratively, it pins me down literally. Horizontal surfaces are forever my flotation cushions through life. I was also diagnosed with chronic fatigue syndrome, CFS, also known as myalgic encephalomyelitis, ME, a badly named severe post-infectious condition that involves permanently reduced blood volume, autonomic disorders, and genes that have been deactivated. 7 years into my illness, further testing would reveal a clearer diagnosis. I had an acquired mitochondrial disease. Mitochondria are the powerhouses in each of the cells in our bodies, and they are found most densely in skeletal and autonomic muscle tissue. They metabolize nutrients and oxygen into energy in an intricate 200-step process. Each of us is born with a number of unique genetic mutations, and we acquire additional mutations throughout our lives. A particular mutation unmasked by a particular pathogen may result in a mitochondrial error, which can then cause metabolic disease. In my case, the pathogen may have been the virus that was spreading through the small European town I visited. Or it may have been something in the hotel water I drank one night. There was also the sick surgeon next to me on my flight home, though by then I had already succumbed to strange and severe symptoms. 15 years into my illness, I would learn about tick-borne encephalitis, TBE, a member of the Flaviviridae family, which includes West Nile virus. Lyme disease can be a co-infection with TBE, though if so in my case it resolved. TBE is not yet known to have crossed the Atlantic to North America, and my United States doctors at the time would not have recognized the symptoms. But its bizarre biphasic onset matched my illness presentation, flu-like symptoms, followed by several weeks later by systemic paralysis-like weakness and autonomic dysfunction, with a poor long-term prognosis. And here we have a one-page coda in this section called Epilogue. Pathogens, those critical ingredients in the primordial ocean from which life originally emerged, helped shape all species, and it was because of a pathogen that I had found myself nose to tentacle with a snail. While illness keeps me always aware of my mortality, I realize that what matters most is not that I survive, nor even that my species survives, but that life itself continues to evolve. As the Holocene mass extinction rushes on, which species will be left? And what new creatures will evolve that we cannot now imagine? For what creature could ever have imagined us? At the moment, we humans are lucky to co-inhabit the earth with mollusks, even if we are a recent presence in their much longer history. I hope the terrestrial snails, secreted away in their burrows by day across the earth's vast landscapes, will continue their mysterious lives, gliding slowly and gracefully through the night, millions of years into the future. go. And you've got to see this little fellow at the bottom of the page. Hopefully you can see that little guy. Okay, there's like 5 pages of acknowledgments, and then there's this little appendix, and then there are pages and pages of source material, which I will not read, even though we used to read those things back in the day. Oh, and there's one final quote on the very last page, which I will read. Appendix: Terraria. I always keep several terraria of woodland plants in the house year-round. If you want to make a plant terrarium, you can use any glass container or jar. Keep in mind that mosses, ferns, lichens, and other woodland plant species are often slow-growing. Taking a few plants from a large patch in an unprotected species on land you own or have permission to dig on is usually fine. However, if you don't know your plants well, please consult a botanist first to make sure you are not taking species that might be endangered and protected by law. Alternatively, woodland plant material can be acquired from horticultural suppliers who specialize in their propagation. If the terrarium is to be inhabited by a living creature, make sure the propagated plants are organically grown. Loam from the woods usually contains eggs of some creature or another, so occasionally an unexpected new friend may hatch out and surprise you. Much can be learned from observing a snail where you find it and letting it continue on with its life undisturbed. If you choose to keep a snail for a little while, please give it the most natural home possible in a quiet location and provide fresh water and its familiar diet. Treat your snail gently, minimize handling, and return it to the same location where it was found within the same season. I was glad when my snails were returned to their natural habitat, or their native habitat. And while I loved having them stay with me, I am most comfortable knowing that wild creatures are in their wild environments. What a sensitive soul this Elizabeth Tova Bailey is. And here's a final quote from our book, and then I will show you the last little picture of a snail gliding over a fallen leaf. Oh, and there's a color one too. Well, I'll just show them to you now since I'm talking about them. There's a nice black and white one. And then there's this color one on some moss. Probably, hopefully coming out a little bit. Our final quote. Oh, I should read you about Elizabeth Tova Bailey too. So many things. Our slow journey continues, creeping along the pages. Here is a final quote from Snails and Their Houses, 1888. And yet, when lovemaking is not in question, the snail is by no means sociable, although it has been observed in one branch of the family, snails engaged in mutually polishing a neighbor's shell with the foot. Here's a little about Elizabeth Tova Bailey. Elizabeth Tova Bailey's essays and short stories have been published in the Yale Journal for Humanities in Medicine, the Missouri Review, Northwest Review, and the Sycamore Review. In addition to her book awards, she has received several Pushcart Prize nominations and a notable essay listing in Best American Essays. She is on the Writers' Council for the National Writing Project, and she lives in Maine. Her website is www.elizabethtovabailey.net. Published by Algonquin Books of Chapel Hill. And there we have it. The sound of a wild snail eating. Winner of the John Burroughs Medal. Beautiful indeed. I hope you had as much fun listening as I did listening of a sort in the snail's silent world.